Science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. Hi, I'm Juliette Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote, named for Adam Smith, brought to you by Liberty Fund. To learn more, visit www.adamsmithworks.org. Welcome back. For the past decade or so, productivity and success have been central topics of conversation, particularly figuring out how to get there, how to be successful. These discussions influence everything from how we educate our children, how we organize our workplaces, to how we structure our lives. The narrative that often prevails when we talk about this sort of stuff is the narrative of specialization. You've probably heard of Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours rule. But today, on August 15th, 2022, I'm honored to be speaking to David Epstein, who is an advocate for generalization. And I don't think he needs an introduction, but here we go. He's the author of 2 best-selling books, Range and The Sports Gene. You should go check them out if you haven't. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So before we get started, what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
Well, I think since I'm going to relate it to my work, I wish when I were your age that I was more cognizant of a psychology finding known as the end of history illusion, which is this finding that everyone, if you ask, have you learned a lot and changed a lot based on your experiences in the past? Everyone says yeah, of course. But then if you ask, well, are you going to change a lot in the future? People tend to say, well, not as much. I think now I kind of know who I am. And in fact, we're always wrong. We underestimate future change at every time point in life. That's not to say it doesn't slow down. Sort of the fastest period of change, and this goes to everything, like what you value in friends, how you want the world to be, how you like to spend your free time, what you think you're good at. All those things change. The most rapid time of change is about age 18 to your late 20s, but it never stops. And all through life, we're like a work in progress, claiming to be finished. And I think that's a really profound thing to understand, because it means that we can always learn new things, we can always change, and that our search for sort of where we fit in the world, personally and professionally, should be an ongoing lifetime journey rather than something that's like, oh, I just graduated college, I have to have it figured out and just pick something and stick to it. That's not realistic, and I think counterproductive based on what we know about how people evolve.
Wow. This is throwing me back to how literally yesterday afternoon I was telling one of my friends, I think I've settled. I I understand myself. I'm grounded in who I am. But obviously I said that at the end of high school. I'm 1 year into college, and I think that's some good advice, because I'm going into this second year and there's no way. I mean, logically, it makes sense that there's no way. But even after college, I know a lot of people who say the second you leave undergrad, the second you leave academia, in a sense, that's when it's over. You're stuck in your personality. That's who you are for life.
I don't want to imply that it's bad for you to have had that feeling that you're grounded. I mean, it's great to have a feeling that you're getting to know yourself better and feeling more stable. I think the mistake is, well, one, there will be things that will upset that over the course of your life, both changes to you and the world around you. And I think the downside is if you expect stability and therefore think that you need to just pick something and stick to it for the rest of your life. So I don't think it's bad to have that feeling. You should have a feeling of learning more about yourself. I think it's only counterproductive when you equate that to the idea that you have to pick and stick with sort of a lane for the rest of your life, especially when you're young.
And we'll get into that, because obviously this is related to what we're going to be talking about today. So let's jump into that. The full title of the book is Range: Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. In other words, it makes the case that specialization is maybe overrated, and how really generalists are also awesome. I like that because I, may be slightly biased, consider myself to be a generalist, and so I like this narrative. You start by outlining 2 athletic success stories side by side, and you do this geniusly, if I may say so myself. One follows the generalist path and the other follows the specialist path. Can you tell us these stories and how they represent the 2 paths?
Sure. Yeah. So one of those stories, I think, will be really familiar, even to people that so I like to use sports as analogies. And so I took these stories from sports, and one I think will be familiar to people even that don't really care at all about sports, which is that of Tiger Woods, who his father famously gave him a putter when he was 7 months old. At 10 months, he started imitating his father's swing. At 2 years old, you can go on YouTube and see him on national television showing off his swing. By 3, he's saying, I'm going to be the next Jack Nicklaus, the next greatest in the world. He's famous as a teenager. You fast forward to the age of 21, he's the greatest golfer in the world. It's kind of that quintessential 10,000 hours story, and what people think about the 10,000 hours depends on where they read about it. But, typically people think it means that the only route to expertise is through 10,000 hours of so-called deliberate practice, which is like very specialized and focused, not sort of unstructured, exploratory. And so the other story that I contrasted that with is one that I think is sort of less familiar to people, about a boy who, played a number of different sports as a kid, some tennis, swimming, basketball. His mom was actually a tennis coach, but she declined to coach him because he wouldn't return balls normally. So wasn't as into that deliberate practice, sort of wanted to do some free form creative stuff. Kept playing a bunch of more sports, rugby, badminton, volleyball, handball, soccer. When his coaches wanted to move him up to play with older boys, he actually declined because he just wanted to talk about pro wrestling with his friends after practice. And he kept trying more sports, skiing. I can't remember if I said handball or not, but just, skateboarding. And he wasn't focused on being the next great from a young age like Tiger was. In fact, when he became good enough to warrant an interview with his local newspaper, and the reporter asked what he would buy with his first paycheck if he ever became a pro, the boy said a Mercedes, and his mother was appalled and asked if she could listen to the interview recording. Turned out the boy had said mehr CDs in Swiss German. He just wanted more CDs, not a Mercedes. And his mom was fine with that. So I think that hint will give away to some people that the person I'm talking about is Roger Federer, who turned out okay, every bit as famous as an adult as Tiger Woods. And yet even tennis enthusiasts don't usually know anything about his developmental story. And by the way, I talked about some of this stuff, not to go on too long here, but I talked about some of this data in the sports realm, particularly, only the introduction of the book is about sports. But I talked about it in a small group where Serena Williams happened to sit in the second row, and I was totally petrified because I thought she was more of a Tiger story, and you can have all the data you want in the world, and it doesn't matter if the GOAT stands up and says you're an idiot, and it's still going to be a bad day. And she stands up and says, I think my father was ahead of his time. He had us do gymnastics and taekwondo and ballet and track and field. And he took us off the traveling tour so we could focus on school when it was getting too crazy. And Venus and I learned an overhead football throwing motion, and that's what we still use to practice our serve and all this stuff. And I was senior writer at Sports Illustrated and never even heard that. So I think I used these stories at the beginning, the Roger versus Tiger at the beginning of the book, to kind of exemplify two different paths, both of which led to expertise, but setting up the question of which usually is the more typical path to expertise. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer to.
No, I mean, that was awesome. Thank you. So it's not that you have to follow a specific path, one or the other. It's just that the common belief, and I mean, as you were saying, the commonly told narrative is the one of specialization, starting super early. And that to me is the second important aspect of the book, that it can even be detrimental, this narrative that you need to specialize early to have this sort of performance. And this diversity that these athletes have made them such amazing athletes in a sense. And it's not that Tiger Woods was not an amazing athlete, but it's just maybe not as common as we think. What's so powerful about the generalist path?
Totally. And you reminded me of something I should have said, which is obviously Roger and Tiger both made it, to the pinnacle of their sports. But the Roger, according to the research in this area, the Roger path turns out to be the typical one, and the Tiger path is the exceptional one. So typically athletes who go on to become elite have early on, they spend less time in deliberate practice than lower level athletes. They have what scientists call a sampling period, where they gain these, so they sort of try a bunch of different activities, sometimes in a lightly structured setting, so not always deliberate practice. They learn these broad general skills that scaffold later technical skills. They learn about their own, very importantly, they learn about their own interests and abilities. And they delay specializing until later than peers that plateau at lower levels. So both Tiger and Roger, again, made it to the pinnacle, but we hear the story that we all tell is the exception, not the norm. And that turned out to be the case in a lot of other domains where I look, not always, but in a lot of other domains. And to relate that to the Roger story. So some of what happens, so let me see if we can continue the analogy. Some of what happens, there's a researcher named Arne Gulich, who's kind of at the forefront of looking at this in sports. And what his conclusions for why this works in sports is sort of threefold. Is one, people develop broader skills when they try different things, like different forms of problem solving, essentially, physical problem solving in this case, that forces them to build these sort of more general skills that then can be applied more widely to any new thing that they have to learn. So that's one. You get this benefit of developing these general skills that become like a canvas for you to learn a wider breadth of specific things. Second, they tend to have better what's called match quality, which is a term that describes the degree of fit between someone's interests and abilities and the work that they do. Turns out to be very important for both your productivity and your sense of fulfillment. And three, they tend to avoid like both physical and mental burnout for a longer time, essentially. And I think those findings from sports translate well, not exactly, but quite well to a lot of the other domains I examined, whether that was technological innovation, or the arts, where having this broader base, one, allows you to build skills that accomplish what psychologists call transfer, which is to be able to take your knowledge and skills and apply them to new situations that you've never seen before. So sort of the definition of creativity and innovation. And it also certainly, having had a wider array of experiences, and I think this is shown in the research quite strongly, leads people to find better match quality, so a better fit with whatever work they pick, whether that's what they choose to major in, what career they set out in at first. And three, that burnout is a lot less likely when people, one, have multiple things that they're interested in. And in fact, having a hobby that's unrelated to your work improves your self-efficacy, your feelings of competence. And three, burnout is a lot less likely when people have a good fit with the work that they're doing. So I don't think it's a perfect correspondence to sport, but I think sort of the general principles of why this turns out to be the norm rather than the exception in terms of people traveling the path to achievement and fulfillment is sort of similar in some ways to the Roger versus Tiger story, if that makes sense. Am I stretching too much for an analogy there?
No. I think to me, it makes perfect sense. So I guess given that there's so much research and that there seems to be such a clear connection between generalists and success in this sense, what do you think has caused the specialist narrative to prevail for such a long time?
I think a few things. I mean, I think, for one, I think it's intuitive, right? Like, I think it's our brains. Like when we see two people in anything, whether it's sports, whether it's class, career, income, whatever, we tend to see two people that they're separated by, X amount. I think our brain interprets that as one point in a trajectory that will be stable forever. Whether we know better or not, I think that's our intuition, that when we see two people separated by a certain amount, we think they'll always be separated by that amount. So we think we're sort of seeing their potential, and that they'll be on a linear trajectory. And so that whoever's ahead, so it's always best to be ahead. The problem is research on human development and skill development doesn't look anything like that. Like one of the major messages is that development is really zigzaggy. And except for the most basic skills that aren't really relevant to like any of the kind of work that most people do, people don't develop on a linear trajectory. And so one, I think our intuition sends us in the wrong direction, always wanting a head start, which by the way, if I had to pick like what I think would be like the most accurate, but maybe less marketable subtitle of range, I think really the most pervasive theme is that sometimes the things you can do to get a head start will actually undermine your long-term development. Whether that's learning a sports skill, whether that's choosing what to study in college, whether that's settling down in a career, whatever it is, that sometimes the thing that you can do that'll cause immediate progress, whether that's, I write in the book, whether that's learning math skills, they can undermine your longer term development. So our intuition, I think, leads us astray. Secondly, I think a lot of the advice to specialize, like increasing, division of labor and specialization has been incredibly important historically. And I think for much of the 20th century, when we were largely an industrial economy, the advice to be more specialized and settle down did make sense, because people didn't have to reinvent themselves in their careers as regularly and learn new things. Companies were much, much longer lived. People faced work for most people tended to look the same, more similar from one year to the next. They could face repetitive problems. Lateral mobility was very limited in a way that it's not now. But then you move into this information or knowledge economy, creativity economy, whatever you want to call it, we have now. And suddenly we prize people who can engage in knowledge creation and creative problem solving, and who can do that transfer, taking their knowledge and skills and applying it to new situations. And those people have tremendous lateral mobility, and like everyone else are forced to relearn and reinvent over their career. And so I think the advice to sort of settle down quickly and do the same thing sometimes comes from, a generation or two where that did make more sense, because the work world wasn't changing as rapidly. And that sort of settling down and long-term specialization in a narrow area probably did work out better. And so I think it's partly our intuition, but I think it's also the fact that the world we're working in has changed. And so some of the kind of skills that are most rewarded has also changed.
How do you think that in this kind of space where people like to, or at least like to believe in the specialization path, and that's the one that we kind of prize and talk about, how is your book received?
Interestingly, a lot better than I thought, because I am kind of self-conscious about the subtitle, I should say, because I think the book, is an argument for broadening skills and broadening perspectives and delaying specialization. But I made sure in the last chapter to focus on like doctors and scientists who in the scheme of humanity are quite specialized, but also wanted to show that, look, even these people who are way into their career in very specialized careers, at a certain point sacrifice increasing depth for some breadth and gain this huge advantage because of it. But I was very self-conscious about it. So for example, I got invited to speak to, because my first book was about genetics and sports, I would get invited to talk to a lot of like medical groups, and surgeons were really interested in it. And so I got invited back to talk to a group of surgeons when Range came out that I talked to before. And these were hyper specialists, like what Atul Gawande would call the proverbial left ear surgeons. Like that's a joke, but that's kind of, they were really specialized. And so I decided, in fact, Roger Federer's surgeon was in the audience, but I decided, okay, I might as well just lean into the things that I wrote about. There's no hiding it, right? They're inviting me for it. And so I talked about how increasing specialization in medicine had been both inevitable and beneficial, that it would be crazy to argue anything else. Probably more so than in like any other field in the world. And yet it's also been an under-recognized double-edged sword. So to give an example of what I mean and what I talked about was, so specialized surgeons have fewer complications in their procedures. That's great. Specialized surgeons, even if you control for the number of times they've done a procedure, the surgeons who self-identify as specialized still have fewer complications for some reason that, I don't know, something about just self-identifying as a specialist. That said, they're also the most likely to do procedures when they're not needed, when they can be harmful, or when they aren't indicated, and to hold on and continue doing those procedures long after they've been shown by research not to work or to be dangerous. And so you can have this situation where you have a group of specialists, you're less likely to have a complication on your surgery that you may not have needed in the first place, or that you shouldn't have gotten. And sometimes psychologists call this the Einstein effect, where when somebody has done a certain like problem solving procedure over and over. They'll keep doing it even when it's no longer appropriate. And so I talked about this to this audience, and kind of to my surprise, they loved it. What was not as great was they said like, oh yeah, we all know this is a problem. Like these procedures are done when they're not needed. They're done reflexively. They're done too much, et cetera, et cetera. And they all seemed to think that it was not them, but their colleagues doing it. And so that could be true. Like these were people who volunteered to come to professional development events. So maybe it was selected for that. But I think that's probably not true. And it's probably this cognitive bias of it's very hard for people to recognize that they're the ones doing some of this. So I'd say it's been accepted, because I would say medicine was the area that I was the most nervous about, because I have a lot of respect for the industry. I've written a lot about the industry, and also, it's the one that I think is most associated with specialization. And so it was better received than I thought, but there also seems to be some cognitive biases in receiving it that I didn't anticipate that may mean, even if it's received well, it doesn't make that much of an impact there.
And I mean, in the book, you mention how if there's even one generalist in a group of surgeons, there have been medical breakthroughs. It kind of changes the course of possibility. It's kind of, my mom always says about specialization and about the tools that you have. When all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And
that's the Einstein effect. Yep.
She loves to say that. She always says that. And I just think that it's particularly relevant here. As many lives as it saves, it's hard when all you're trained to do is use a hammer. You can convince yourself that almost anything looks like a nail, if that's the one thing you have in your toolkit, if that's the one thing you can use.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because in talking about medicine, they're in some of the medical journals, as there's been increasing recognition of this sort of reflex to use the hammer, basically, even when the problem isn't a nail. There have been some researchers who've been coining terms, like one that's like Latin terms, I call the oculostenotic reflex, which doesn't really matter what it really means. But basically it means that certain practitioners will have such a reflex to do a certain procedure once they see a certain thing, that even if it's not the right solution, like they'll use the hammer no matter what comes up, And so I think this is being increasingly recognized, because it's showing up in medical literature as people giving names to these sort of reflexes to use the proverbial hammer.
So let's throw a bone to the specialists. You talk about how it's clear that in certain domains, it's maybe not important, but it's more likely that specialization at a young age will prevail. You talk about chess and the Polgar family. Can you tell us a little bit about that story and how and why chess is one of those areas where specialization is appropriate?
Sure. So the Polgar family story is, it's not as famous as like the Tiger story, but it's another one that appears in, a bunch of best-selling books. And basically it revolves around a man named Laszlo Polgar, a Hungarian man who decided to teach his 3 daughters chess from a very early age. And just to put it in context, he was born in like the mid-40s. Decided to teach his daughters chess from a very early age, at a time when like there weren't as many competitive opportunities for women in chess. And it wasn't because he had 3 daughters. It wasn't because he cared so much about chess particularly, but he wanted to show that with basically a head start in narrowly focused technical practice, that anyone could become a genius in anything. And in fact, 2 of his daughters went on to become grandmaster chess players. And the other one became very good. And so, so it's this kind of amazing personal experiment that he decided to run, and incredibly admirable. I think the problem comes when, like the Tiger story, we try to extrapolate that story to everything else that we want to be good at in our own lives, because in some ways, golf and chess are in some ways like uniquely horrible models of most things that people want to learn. So extrapolating is a problem. And that's because they are what the psychologist Robin Hogarth termed kind learning environments, at least more kind learning environments. And that means that the next steps and goals are sort of clear for you. The rules are clear and don't change. Patterns repeat. Feedback is quick and accurate. Not tons of human dynamics involved, etc. On the other end of the spectrum would be what Hogarth called wicked learning environments, where like work next year won't look like work last year. Feedback is delayed or inaccurate. Patterns don't just repeat, etc. And chess, really, the grandmaster's advantage is largely based on knowledge of recurring patterns, right? Stable rules and knowledge of recurring patterns, such that if you haven't actually started studying, if you're a competitive chess player and you didn't start studying those chess patterns by about age 12, then your chances of reaching international master status or higher — international master status is 1 down from grandmaster — drops from like 1 in 4 to about 1 in 55. So you really, in that domain, your chances are greatly, greatly diminished if you didn't start studying early on. But I think the domain itself, one, is not representative of a lot of other domains. And two, the fact that it is so structured that way is why it's, relatively speaking, so easy to automate. So, if you're in a domain like that, obviously chess is entertainment, so that will, and competition, so that will keep being valued in that way. But in a lot of domains, the ones that have those kind learning environment characteristics are the ones that are, most likely to be automated.
I don't know if we're going to automate golf, but I guess that's probably not something you're thinking of.
Yeah, there is a golf. I was just talking to a guy who like coaches or consults with some of the best golf players in the world, and he was showing me videos of a robot golfer. But actually, what his point was that even the robot golfer, which you can calculate to like perfectly the trajectory of the shot, it still had trouble with like the wind and stuff like that. But it was funny. But also, I think golf is like, sports are for human entertainment, right? Like if we wanted to see the fastest thing running the 100 meters, we'd have a cheetah, but it's like a human endeavor. So I think that's a different category for entertainment.
There's something about humans doing things that we care about so much, because I guess it is an extension of us, no matter who it is, because it is our species.
I agree. And even seeing it in person, right? Like people still like to go to the theater when, you can get like a lot of the greatest actors in the world, like on Netflix in 2 seconds, but I think there's still something kind of magical and engaging about interacting with people in person.
It's human achievement. It's connection. I feel like that's what we live for in a sense. I don't know.
You seem like a very much more mature undergraduate than I was. I'll put it that way. So I won't speak for everyone, just myself.
Thank you. I'm still pretty immature, but
well, I set the bar low with myself. So, so it's not that hard to be more mature than I was at the time.
So let's, maybe retract that bone from the specialists a little bit. The 10,000 hours rule. We kind of talked about this a little bit, but what are some of your favorite examples or data that challenge that view?
Can I talk about the data that supported that view in the first place? Is that okay? Okay. Yeah, because I think it's so famous, but I think like almost nobody who's not a researcher in that area has read the research that underlies this incredibly famous rule. So it started with, nor should they. That's like the job for people like me. But it started with work done by a man named K. Anders Ericsson and his colleagues, who was a researcher at Florida State. And the first study that sort of blew it up was in 1993. And it was a study of 30 violinists, so a small study, who were already in a world-class music academy. And what it found was that the 10 best of them, who the teachers deemed had the potential to go on to become international soloists, had spent 10,000 hours on average in so-called deliberate practice. Again, this is like very effortful, focused on error correction, by the age of 20. And then the next group down, who could be like professional players, had spent less time. And the bottom group, who they called the future teachers, their wording, not mine, had spent less time on average in deliberate practice by age 20. And so this was the origin of the 10,000 hours rule. The problem, I think there are a few important problems here. And feel free to interrupt me if I go on too long about this, but obviously, like, years of my life have been obsessed with this. So the first problem is that you have what statisticians call a restriction of range, where you restricted the people in the study, the subjects, based on something correlated with or your dependent variable. So you're doing a study of what causes skill, and you picked people already in a world-class music academy. So you're already only taking the 1%ers of skill, which can really mess up some of the conclusions you make sometimes. So to give an example, like in my first book, I did just a simple analytics analysis that showed that height in the American population is among men is highly correlated with points scored in the NBA, right? No big surprise. Like taller people tend to be in the NBA. But if you restrict the range to only people who are already in the NBA, then the correlation becomes negative because guards score more points, the shorter players. And so if you didn't understand, that restriction of range issue, and you just did that study blindly, you would say, you would tell parents to have short kids so they could score more points in the NBA, right? Because you wouldn't realize that the correlation reverses. And so one, you have that problem in this study. Maybe a bigger problem is that they didn't include, and the first thing that sort of raised my eyebrow, because I had come off of a path training to be a scientist into journalism, and so sort of, would look for the numbers and studies because that was like one of my advantages as a journalist. They didn't include measures of variance in the research. So they said, this best group practiced 10,000 hours on average. I said, well, what's the variance? Like, did most of them practice 10,000 hours, or did one of them practice like 50,000 hours and most of them were way under, And it turns out when that data was eventually revealed was that basically nobody practiced 10,000 hours. A small number of people went way over, and some of them were under. Some of those, that top group had practiced less than people in the lower groups. And so this is the story, if you look at skill acquisition literature in general, that there's incredible individual variability. So to go back to chess, for example, some people, it takes 11,053 hours on average to reach international master status. But some people have made it in 3,000 hours. And some people were being tracked at 25,000 hours and they still hadn't made it. So you can have an 11,053 hours rule, but it doesn't tell you anything at all about the reality of this skill acquisition, and the importance of getting people in the right spot, for their talents. And so I think the 10,000 hours rule, to the extent that it means that practice is important, yes, that's totally uncontroversial. I don't think anybody would argue with that. But otherwise, beyond that, I think it didn't really have a solid foundation in the first place. So I know I got away from your initial question, but I think that's a really important sort of thing to acknowledge when we get into this discussion.
And really fast, did they just pull that number out of their butts? Like, how is it such a round number? When I was talking about this with all my friends, trying to think through this and where I wanted to go with this interview and all of that, this was this recurring question. Everyone was like, how did they come up with that number? There's no way that was just the number. It's too round.
Yes, that is a great question. You have a critical eye. I wish more scientists had asked that question, right? Because when you see numbers like that, it's good to be, when I see numbers that are either too round or claiming to be so precise that they're out to 10 decimal points, both of those raise my eyebrow. Because I'm like, nothing's ever that precise and nothing's that round, right? And so I asked, it took me longer to come up with it, but I asked a similar question to that of the researchers. And basically what they said was that the data in that study were collected based on retrospective recall of the musicians. So basically it wasn't a tracking study. It didn't track these musicians as they, over time. It asked them to try to recount, their practice year by year. And they were actually inconsistent when they were asked to do that multiple times, to look for replicability. And so even the same person, when they had to do it multiple times, didn't recount their hours of practice in their life perfectly accurately. And so ultimately the researchers decided to basically ballpark round it, essentially, because even, they didn't put in the paper the fact that the people weren't totally consistent on their recall of practice hours. And so they just basically went with, it was about 10,000 hours, which I think is Again, I think those researchers have made some very important contributions, but I think that paper, which became like the most famous paper in all of skill acquisition literature, was not rigorously done.
To me, it's a little discrediting to know that they hadn't put that in the paper. If they had, I would still, it would still be more credible to me than knowing that they just left it out entirely. Less honest, maybe, is my issue with that. Can you give us a few examples that challenge it?
Yeah, I mean, almost, gosh, like where to begin? There's some great, so they put out they put out a paper. So after my first book came out in 2013, sort of criticizing some of this, they put out the paper the next year that did share some of that original data, which, by the way, showed that some of their conclusions could not be correct. So I think they had missed some things. And so this was after, 20 years later. And so some people sort of jumped on that. And, there was one group of researchers, Brooke McNamara and David Hambrick, and I think it was Frederick Oswald, who did a meta-analysis where they looked at like tons of studies of deliberate practice in music, in sports, in education, and a little bit in other sort of jobs out in the work world. And basically they found that the 10,000 hours theory, this idea that there's kind of no such thing as talent and it's only accumulated hours of deliberate practice, it didn't really hold anywhere. So in some areas, like games and sports, the hours of deliberate practice accounted for like a moderate amount of variation in performance. In other areas, like more in like the work world, accounted for very little. I think it was like a single digit percent, maybe it was like 1% or something like that. So it was kind of everywhere you looked, you can just sort of pick, and that's the norm. And I think there was actually, this was interesting. I wrote in my newsletter a little while ago about a study that came out that was mostly looking at sports and showing that, again, the 10,000 hours wasn't true. And that in fact, the best like junior athletes were not the best senior athletes, and that the people who developed the quickest, that sort of had the head starts, usually didn't go on to become the best in the long run. And they likened it to a German study of Nobel laureates, scientists, where they found that Nobel laureates progressed more slowly earlier in their career than their colleagues, got tenure later than their colleagues. And they said it was because they were more interdisciplinary earlier in their career. So they progressed more slowly, but obviously they ended up becoming Nobel laureates. So I kind of like that one just because, it's always interesting to think about Nobel laureates. Yeah.
They are, if you want to do research, if you want to contribute something like that, that is it's a nice story that's kind of the opposite of the Tiger Woods story, with someone we care about in the same way, I think.
Well, yeah, you put it better than I did. Well done.
Thank you. I don't think so, though, but thank you. So there are so many remarkable stories in this book, but the listeners are going to have to become readers and read it themselves if they want to hear the rest of them, like the story of how Van Gogh got started. But I kind of want to talk about lesser known successes, like me and my guitar. I don't know. Back at the beginning of the pandemic, I started playing guitar, and my mom and I spent a lot of time going back and forth about whether I should get lessons or not. I really didn't want to. I'm independent. I could do it. Right. What advice would you have given if you were there and could have said something to me and my mom when we were having this discussion?
About whether to get lessons or not? I think it really depends. I think lessons at some point will be important. Not to say, okay, so it depends on the genre, right? Like, so I write about some of the differences between classical and jazz in range. And as it turns out, a lot of the best jazz players ever not only never got lessons, they didn't even learn how to read music, but they did a ton of playing in groups where they would kind of respond to each other and imitate one another. And so I think the question, more than if you're getting formal lessons or not, is like, what kind of developmental environment do you have? I think I think getting lessons could help you learn sort of some of the thing, and depending on the kind of playing that you're doing, because there is, there's a section in the book where I talk about like an eminent professional guitarist, also an eminent instructor, and he advocates for initially letting people do some fooling around, even though that will slow them down early on. So he likens it to language learning, where your parents don't like start by teaching you grammar. They start by throwing you in and you struggle and you learn some things. And then later you learn the grammar when you're kind of perfecting it. And that he says that that's like the people who go the other route, if they sort of are really learning sort of the rigorous classical rules and things like that, they get a head start, but later on they become sort of less flexible in the things that they can learn. So I think what I would want for you would be a situation where you can learn some of the basics, but that you don't become like beholden to them. I think that's the same thing for writing too. It's like, it's good at some point to know a lot of the rules, but also not to be beholden to them. And so I would probably have said, take some lessons, but intersperse it with different genres of music. First of all, try to do different genres. So you're doing what's called interleaved practice, which is when you're facing different challenges that helps you build generalized models that you can apply to anything. Do some things on your own, try some imitation, and sort of come up with particular kind of problems you have or pieces you want to learn, and engage a teacher for that. But leave some time for unstructured activity too. I mean, looking back at that 10,000 hour, the original 10,000 hour study, the best musicians spent a huge amount of time, like the things that, to my eye, again, there was tremendous amount of individual variation, but things that set them apart from the other two groups were, one, they slept more. So, whatever, they got more sleep. That's good for learning stuff. And they spent a lot of time like on their own, just like playing and trying on their own. And so I think it's really a balance. I don't think there's a problem with engaging a teacher. I just would make sure you have plenty of variety and also leave some time for yourself to do like semi-structured or lightly structured activity. What did you decide to do?
So luckily for me, she just started reading your book. So I have been teaching myself guitar. I have a service that I use to kind of learn specific ways to do the chords, because I don't know, it's a lot of stretching your fingers. And right. I felt more comfortable kind of learning the most efficient way to do that sort of stuff. But in terms of playing around, I wanted to do it. And so she let me. And obviously I'm not very well known. I'm not Mozart, but, it's been cool.
Yeah. I was going to say, how's it going? When did you start? Like, when did you first start guitar? Like,
so I started in 2020, around the time I started this podcast. It's been a while.
A while? That's not very long as like in the scheme of guitar learning.
Yeah. Well, yeah, maybe not, but I think the reason why it felt like it was a while is because it's been a struggle, which actually you talk about in your book a good amount, where that's the value of the learning process, in a sense, is this struggle that can help you improve fundamentally. And it also makes you more creative. I like that part, because then I was like, yes, purposeful struggle.
I mean, the cognitive psychologist Nate Cornell, who I talked to a bunch for the book, as he put out, I want to attribute it because it's nice words. He said, ease, difficulty isn't a sign that you aren't learning, but ease is, right? You want to be struggling. It's when you get into a place where it's coming too easily, that's where you're probably not learning anything.
And something that I found fascinating in your book is that you made it clear that there is a value to struggling, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't ever change your path or your job or what you're doing, that you shouldn't be afraid to quit, and that persistence just to persist is not necessarily good. Can you kind of draw that distinction for us?
Yeah. And I think I also want to mention, since a lot of people are probably familiar with grit, Angela Duckworth here, because, so grit is this psychological construct that basically means like persevering and sticking to the same thing can be important for success. And I think there's some important caveats to that. So like, to think about some of the work I wrote about in range, like the Harvard-led study called the Dark Horse Project, where This was about how people find fulfilling work, work with high match quality, again, that fits their interests and abilities. And the reason it was called the Dark Horse Project is because most of these people, not all of them, but again, because with anything with people, there's tremendous variability. But the norm was that they would come in and say, well, I did this one thing, whatever. I went to medical school or I took this job and I thought I'd like it, but I really didn't, or I wasn't as good at it as I thought. So then I went this other direction and that was more boring than I thought. This other thing I got interested in, and they keep doing this sort of zigzagging until they find a space where they fit. And they would come in and say like, well, don't tell people to do what I did because I came out of nowhere. And that's why it ended up becoming named the Dark Horse Project, because the norm was people saying, yeah, well, I came out of nowhere. And that turns out to be the norm for how careers develop today. And I think the approach that those people who found career fulfillment took was to say, instead of like looking around and saying, here's who's younger than me and has more than me, they'd say, here are my skills and interests. Here are the opportunities in front of me. I'm going to do this one. And maybe a year from now, I'll change because I will have learned something new about myself or my opportunities will have changed. And so I think the approach they take is toward sort of short-term, not that they don't necessarily have long-term goals, but they hold them very flexibly. They're willing to deviate from them and be opportunistic as they learn more about themselves and their opportunities change. And so I think like knowing when to change can be a real competitive advantage. Annie Duke, the legendary poker player, has a book I just blurbed coming out about this called Quit. That's basically about how knowing when to quit can become like a huge competitive advantage. And when I mentioned Angela Duckworth, even Angela, so the week my book came out, if you Google "summer is for sampling," Angela's newsletter was about how it's important to try a bunch of different things before focusing in. And she notes that it took her a decade of her adult life to figure out where to apply her grit. A decade. She's like the guru of grit. And more recently, one of her newsletters was called the paramecium principle. So, basically she uses the analogy of a paramecium to say like, that's how you should progress through, your career, where like a paramecium, I guess, as it senses food, it like moves in a direction and it's like a single celled organism. And if it senses food in that direction, it goes a little more in that direction. And if there's more food, it goes a little more in that direction. And if not, it turns in another direction. And she suggested this is kind of how we should progress when we do stuff is, am I learning something? Am I getting something? Okay, go a little more in that direction. Am I learning more? Am I getting more? Go a little more in that direction. If I'm not, pivot and go into another direction. And I think that's very similar to these dark horses where they continually reassess what met their expectations, what didn't. What did they learn about themselves? What are they good or bad at? What are they interested in or bored with? And just keep making these strategic pivots. So I don't like to frame it as quitting because that has so many connotations with it. So I like to think of it more as like strategic, opportunistic pivoting or something like that. And I think what we need to be doing is constantly reflecting. It's called self-regulatory learning, thinking about your own thinking. What fit my expectations? What did I learn about myself? What do I need to learn to progress? Who do I need to help me learn those things? And answering questions like that repeatedly while we're doing something, and that can really inform how we should pivot. So even though I think in some cases it amounts to smart quitting, I think quitting has so much stigma attached to it that I try to use different language.
I mean, that's what language, I just got out of this program and we learned about rhetoric and how words do matter. Phrasing something in an awkward or different way that isn't usual actually opens your brain to thinking about it in a way that maybe you didn't before. And it's a lot of the time because of connotation or you're just used to it. So you're kind of desensitized to what it actually means. And so I think I like pivoting. It's a good way to phrase it.
There's in the afterword to the paperback, I added an afterword to the paperback. I'm not sure if you've seen that one or not, but I'll send it to you if not. But I write a little bit about this new talent matching program in the Army called talent-based branching that essentially amounts to giving people a chance to try a number of different careers. And as they learn about like what they're good and bad at and what they're interested in, what they're not interested in, they can sort of focus in sort of later. And 90% of the people who went through it changed their career choice just by having this opportunity to sample. And I thought that was brilliant to call it talent-based branching because in many ways it's like strategic quitting, but talent-based branching sounds a lot better.
Yeah, no, I haven't read that, but that sounds awesome. If you'd send that to me, I would really appreciate it. So I guess this is all super fascinating and applicable to individuals. And also, this is the last question before the actual last question. So we're wrapping up. But on an individual level, it's super important, right? And I think it's I really enjoy it. And I like to think about this sort of stuff for me and my personal growth, especially because these ideas of productivity and how we should spend our time, they're so prevalent. But it also really matters in terms of education, which starts so young that me as an individual, I can't necessarily make that choice when I'm 5. Mm-hmm. What path do our educational systems usually follow? And what does that mean for generations like mine? And what do we do with this understanding of generalists and pivoting and all of that? What can we do to better our education, I guess?
Yeah, I should say, I mean, I think the education system, like, let's talk about the like pre-college education system. I think that's what we're mostly talking about, because I think in some ways, like, I think there's a ton of issues with higher education in the US, but I also think higher education in the US tends to do a pretty good job of allowing people a sampling period. So
yeah, we're not allowed to declare our major until the end of next year.
Oh, interesting. And then even then you can take, get involved in different clubs or take different classes or whatever. Like, not everything has to be in your major. And I think it's been shown that a lot of the return on the investment in education is not just the stuff you learn, but actually the stuff you learn about yourself that helps you, find a better match fit. And I sort of wrote about that in the chapter about match quality in range. But I think in terms of before higher ed, for one, I think like the public education system is so complicated. Like, I wrote about the space shuttle in range, and I think the public education system is more complicated because you have to serve people in so many different situations from so many different backgrounds with such varying resources. And it has to be sort of like take all comers. And so I always just want to like express some humility when talking about what should change in the education system, because I think it's such a hard challenge. Not only that, but like you think about the number of different adults, who it's like school isn't just for kids, right? It's for adults, and it's for unions of people who work in different areas in the schools. Like there's a lot of different interest groups engaged in education. I think to think about something like realistic, I think one thing we could, and this is probably more practical than you were thinking or asking for, but there's certain things I think we can do right away, like interleaving, which I mentioned briefly before, but maybe I'll define now. So there was a study that came out actually too recently for me to put into range that looked at, it randomized math classrooms. These were middle school math classrooms to different types of learning. Some of them got what's called blocked practice, which is where you do the same type of problem kind of over and over and over, problem type A, B, 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 B. The other classrooms got randomized what's called interleaved practice, where it's like as if you took all those problem types and just threw them in a hat and pulled them out at random. And in the first case, in block practice, you're like the learners tend to progress quickly. They're happy, like they feel like they're learning well, rate their teachers well, everyone's happy. In the interleaved case, progress can be slower and more difficult. Learners might often feel like they're not learning as well because they're going slower. But instead of learning how to execute procedures, they're learning how to match strategies to types of problems. And in that work, when both groups were given a test where people had to apply their knowledge to new problems, the interleaved practice group blew the block practice group away. And interleaving works because when you're getting this like mix of problems where instead of just like reflexively applying a procedure, you have to think about what is the structure of the problem and apply a strategy, it forces you to build these generalized models in your brain that you can then apply more flexibly, and it'll stick longer. It also helps your memory. And so I think that's the sort of thing where we could implement that in a lot of ways, like tomorrow, to give people more transferable skills that they'll then be able to use in more different ways. I think we can do that whether it's studying, like interleaving, it's applied in a lot of language learning, some of the best language learning apps, whether it's teaching language, whether it's teaching math, whatever it is. You can mix things up in a way that causes people to progress more slowly early on, but gives them these actually broader generalizable skills, because I think that's something we can do without like overhauling the education system, and that teachers could be taught to do it quite quickly. In terms of like the greater conceptual overhauls, I think that some parts of school should look more sort of like that Army's talent-based branching, where in many ways the job of a teacher or someone like them is to help an individual figure out, you know, what did they like and what didn't they, what are their strengths and weaknesses, and sort of incorporate the tenets of self-regulatory learning, which in many ways is based on reflection. And I think that should be like with journals that people keep. I think it should be something that's kept every year of their education, where they're actively reflecting on what they're learning, what they need to learn, how to do that, what worked and what didn't work in the past. Because I think even inside of a system that has to be made to kind of accommodate everyone, that there you'll make the most of the experiences you have, which will inform the pivots you're then making when you have a lot more freedom, like in college or beyond, if that makes some sense.
Yeah, that's a great response. And practical is perfect. I think I like actionable items. This is more for me. This is something I've been thinking about a lot. I guess college and things. But how did you get where you are, and why do you do what you do?
How did I get where I'm so...
Take it for whatever you want to take that question.
Okay, I will. I'm just thinking of how much of my rambly, digressive self to be here.
As much as you want.
Right. Okay. So my books are digressive, and that's me organizing my brain. So as you've probably learned over the last hour. So in terms of my career progression, well, there's a sad part to this story, just like disclaimer. I was right in my past life, excuse me. At one point I was training to be a scientist in environmental sciences. And I was also a competitive runner, 800 meter runner in college. And I don't know, I always thought the mile was the worst, but you know, oh, okay. Yes. Maybe it's like one away from whatever you train for is the worst. And one of my training partners, who was also a close friend, as they often are, dropped dead at the end of a mile race. He was one of the top ranked people in his age group in the country. You know, very bright and athletic guy from a family of Jamaican immigrants. And it just really like threw me for a loop. And, you know, my local newspapers said like, well, heart attack. And I'm like, well, what does that even mean for a guy in this? It dawned on me that I didn't even know what that means, like for someone that age in that health. And as I kept thinking about this for a few years, I realized I wanted to look into it. And I had his family sign like a waiver allowing me to gather up his medical records. It turned out he had this genetic condition that was misdiagnosed. It's almost always the cause of young athletes dropping dead. And that got me interested in genetics. And meanwhile, you know, I eventually was like living up in a tent in the Arctic, studying the carbon cycle as part of my grad research, and getting that path looked to me like so narrowly focused, often on stuff that was like not that important to the world. I mean, sometimes, but oftentimes not. Like it was just narrow, you know, you're pushed to specialize just for the sake of specializing. And I decided I really wanted to merge my interests in sports and science and write about sudden cardiac death in athletes. And then I had a science background that would help me do some of that. And long story short, like I made my way into journalism with some like ridiculous jobs, and eventually became the science writer at Sports Illustrated, where I did write about sudden cardiac death in athletes. I was actually a temp when I did that, but it happened that I just got my foot in the door there as a temp. And then the Olympic marathon trials for the 2008 team for the U.S. came to Central Park, and the guy ranked like 6th in the country dropped dead near our office during the race. And, you know, one of the editors was like, don't you know something about this? And so I was, well, yeah, I mean, I knew it was going to happen if I could hang there long enough, because it's more common than people think, not usually among adult athletes, because it's usually teenagers, but I figured, you know, some highly prized recruit, it happens more often than people think. So I knew it was going to happen at some point. And so, you know, I was a temp and wrote like a story that was on the cover of Sports Illustrated, and because I'd been researching this for like several years, and then just became the science writer there. and realized I sort of had a knack for some investigative stuff, and drugs in sports were a big deal. And there were lots of interesting science topics like brain trauma, human performance, all that sort of stuff. And the tragedy with my friend got me interested in genetics. And so I wrote a book about genetics in sports, that was opened up by that interest. And felt like that was my capstone project of sports. So then I left to do more traditional investigative work, drug cartels and bad scientific practices. And then that led to, some of that informed range, but then range was the last thing I did. And then it was like the pandemic, so that kind of brings us to today, basically.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing. That is some serious pivoting, if I may say so myself.
Sorry.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, in retrospect, I realized one thing that's always helped me in my career is, so in science, I think I was shaping up to be, a quite typical scientist. But then you take those typical or average science skills and you bring them over to a sports magazine, and it's like, whoa, you're a Nobel laureate. It's like taking something that's normal in one context and bringing it somewhere where it's rare has been kind of the thing that's worked for me in my career. So I keep making these pivots where I take some skill set or some experience that's normal in one context and then bring it over to somewhere where it's seen as something really important or that can lead to creativity in a different context.
It's very synthesized. I like that. So final question. What is one thing that you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
Oh gosh. I think, wow, there are a lot of things I've changed my mind on. From one of the first things that popped into my head there was that, like, and this will sound really frivolous, but I think it's not, where I thought I was like really good at predicting sports drafts, like who would be good, because I remembered, all the successes when I had made good predictions. And then when I read the research that went into chapter 10 of Range about forecasting, about like who's good at forecasting, and realized how our cognitive biases affect how good we think we are. And I started, because I had done some of this for Sports Illustrated and went and looked back over not just the successes, but all of the predictions, I realized it was not nearly as good as I thought. And that made a big impression on me in realizing that if I don't keep track of my own decisions, then I really overestimate like how good a lot of them were in the past. And that was kind of a scary thing to learn, that even knowing about cognitive biases, I was still subject to them, basically. So that's one thing I changed my mind a lot about. So it sounds like frivolous, but it really had to do with decision-making in general and becoming a better decision maker, where you actually have to keep track of some of your decisions and see, what went well and what didn't, instead of only remembering the good ones. But on another note, I think maybe this will be interesting to you, that I think I don't want to say that I was anti-progress, because I wasn't, but I think when I was younger, I was a lot more skeptical of the idea that you could like set up an innovation market, sort of. I said, well, let's like, even when I was in science, I was like, let's fund this and this and this thing, which are obviously important, and not fund the other stuff. And now I'm very different from that. I'm a firm believer that like you have to put a lot of resources into people exploring curiosities, because you don't really know where the big breakthroughs are going to come from. So you sort of have to empower people with resources and structure, and then let smart, curious people go do their thing. And if you try to manage it too much, you'll actually work against the outcomes that you want. And that is almost a totally opposite position of what I thought when I was younger, where I was like, we should systematize this and, micromanage it to get exactly what we want. And now I think the research shows that you can't do that. And if you do that, you'll actually end up stifling innovation. So you have to accept the fact that some of the things you invest in are going to be wasteful, but you have to give people some freedom to follow curiosities, some of which will be dead ends, if you also want like the massive successes to come.
Once again, I'd like to thank my guest for their time and insight, and I'd like to thank you for listening to the Great Antidote podcast. The Great Antidote is sound engineered by Rich Goyette. If you have any questions, any guests or topic recommendations, please feel free to reach out to me at thegreatantidote@gmail.com. Thank you.